So sorting out the nature of this grand illusion between the relationship between matter, energy, space, time, and movement is the central focus of astrotometry. That is the main meat of the theory and the principles of astrotometry. And the way to approach this scientifically, the two main divisions in astrotometry. The three-dimensional method in astrotometry uses a wave mechanical model that sorts out the standing wave patterns of interfering waveforms as sources for that interference as well. And so the three-dimensional model uses the concept of wave mechanics and three-dimensional geometry in order to sort that out. There's also another version of astrotometry, which is a more completely mathematical or theoretical version of astrotometry that involves a higher dimensional mathematical model that's strictly related to aspects, magnitudes, and what you might call fractal attractors. The concept of what would be this node pattern, the limitations on it, the places where these exist in time-space, is abstracted in the HD model with the concept of a hyperdimensional fractal attractor. And so these are the two main approaches to astrotometry. And the one I'm going to be talking about primarily is the three-dimensional model that uses the wave mechanical notions that we have about the underlying nature of matter. And in astrotometry, the Michelson and Morley experiment, the interpretation of the Michelson and Morley experiment that led to the abolishment in the scientific school of the common notion of the luminiferous ether, is called into question very seriously because of the nature of movement through time. The better understanding that the Earth isn't physically moving through space, but that it's being translated through space, and that has to do with the nature of not only its movement around the sun, but its rotation on its axis. And so there's this inherent spin that falls out of the movement through time. And while you could call this a movement through time-space, because technically in astrotometry there is no movement through time without a consequential movement through space that involves a translation between node patterns that are supersymmetric or hypersymmetric across the points that appear as the photons. That is a space and time translation. But since as three-dimensional creatures, we tend to see this as static, since we tend to see our physical space as persistent, it's better to consider it a hyper-time translation and leave the spatial part of it constant. And so there's a certain relativity that I'm imposing on the model based on our normal conventions of the nature of time, because of our understanding about the nature of the persistence of matter, which is an illusion. And so everything else is considered relative to our physical persistence in the time-space that is the movement through the astrotome. And so one very, very important point in astrotometry is that the physical matter is being translated as well as the energy. What we perceive as the photon, what we perceive as these rays, the points where there seem to be a ray that moves in many different directions, is a clue as to the nature of our movement through time. And those points are the points over which our physical matter folds through space to get us to the next moment in time. And so the understanding of how those patterns form, how the matter and energy relationship actually works, can be, in a sense, reverse engineered from our perception of those types of things by looking at factors like the supersymmetry on the quantum level and the hypersymmetry between the sun-grazing comet and its active region on the sun. We can sort this out in a cosmic way. We can sort out how these hypersymmetric, supersymmetric motions indicate how things are actually moving through time. In the grand illusion, we have this question about the photon that is traveling supposedly from point A to point B. Whether it actually exists anywhere in between these 2 points, when it's observed as leaving from point A and is observed at point B, does it actually exist in between? That's one of the questions, because in astrotometry, it's understood that for the photon to be traveling, that it's moving through hypertime from one place to another. And since the wavelength that we perceive of this photon requires the observation of more than one photon, that wavelength could be completely abstracted in our three-dimensional model as a consequence of a shadow from a higher dimensional object or a higher dimensional world that leaves this impression that something is moving from A to B when actually it's just the same object that's been translated from one place to another through time and space. And so there's this question about the nature of this seventh movement. In the three-dimensional model, the concept is that from the seventh movement, if this is the place where the photon manifests, from the waveforms that hit at the proper angle, the exact proper angle, which would be abstracted as the fractal attractor in the higher dimensional model, when these objects strike here and form this object, when this object materializes in time-space, it has its own wave that it creates in the medium, in the common carrier. And that wave, theoretically, would travel out in all directions. It would theoretically, if this is a standard type of space, it would travel out like this. And so the seventh movement is this other sort of movement. And so it's possible, one of the approaches to astrotometry is to approach this manifestation as coming from simply the geometry of the existing patterns that have not just this one, but are actually also these other circles. And so it's only in a certain space that has to do with a mathematical relationship between the movement in 6 directions that causes this to reform or rematerialize, rippling through time-space to interact with the things that are sextile to it. That's the term from the ancient astrology, sextile. And so there's an angular relationship that would naturally form out of the interference patterns that are indicated from waveforms that are undulating in a particular sort of medium. And so this is really weighing back in to Aristotle's concept of the luminiferous ether. This is really reviving the ancient understanding with a better model for why the Michelson and Morley experiment was unsuccessful. And, you know, Michelson was really upset about that. And this, I think, is what they missed. This is what I think they didn't understand about the nature of the movement of the electromagnetic energy.